Good evening. What I would like to share with you today is my reflections on how Tocqueville can help us understand the future of democracy in America. I'm both American citizen and EU citizen. I have a Romanian passport just in case things are going south in the United States. So this is a deeply personal topic for me in many ways. And I would like to begin by sharing with you the news that everyone follows these days, which is what's going on in America today. Well, January 6, 2021 will be remembered, I think, as one of the darkest days in the recent history of the American Republic. That dark moment of our recent history has raised existential concerns about the future of our country and its democratic institutions threatened by growing polarization and kind of authoritarian leadership. Our political scene across the Atlantic has turned into warfare politics dominated by purity tests and litmus tests meant to distinguish between friends whom we reward and foes whom we fight against, who must be denounced and neutralized. Compromise and bargaining have become, liabilities perceived as weakness, and normal politics has given way to a larger fight for redemptions. It's an existential fight, now or never. The call of the tribe, to use the title of Mario Vargas Llosa's book of essays, has prevailed over appeals to reason, respect for facts, genuine pluralism, and viewpoint diversity, A large part of the electorate, especially but not exclusively on the right, has become tribal and cult-like, feeding on resentment with no clear agenda beyond hating one's opponents. And you see where we've arrived. We've arrived in a world of hyperpolarization, tribalism, and sectarianism. We live in bubbles and echo chambers, a world dominated by fake news, alternative facts, my way or the highway, us versus them, and a declining faith in democratic institutions and norms. So the question that I would like to ask, obviously, is whether America that Tocqueville saw in 1830s bears any resemblance with America today, and whether his views on America can still help us understand our present situation. So that's the question I propose to explore in my keynote address today. But before I try to answer this question, I think it's important to remember that Tocqueville was not the first Frenchman who came to America or wrote about it. Others came to America before him, most notably Chateaubriand in the early 1790s. What is less known is that by the time Tocqueville finished writing Volume 1 of Democracy in America, I think by August 1834, there was no consensus in France on the viability of the American political model. Some expressed doubts concerning the possibility of transplanting it onto the French soil and questioned its long-term prospects because of the existence of slavery. America was accused in the French press of hypocrisy for claiming to be the land of the free while maintaining the institution of slavery. Others feared that the democratic leveling of conditions was going to lead to a mediocre and purely materialistic form of civilization in which individuals would seek only to gain money and make more money ever. So Tocqueville's 2 volumes of Democracy in America represented contribution to this original debate. The first volume, as you know, was published in 1835 and presented, in my view, a relatively optimistic image of the American institutions and its constitution. Tocqueville admired in this volume the Americans' art of self-government and appreciated the ways in which they contributed to their townships and participated in the local administration. He saw with his own eyes how popular sovereignty works and how, for all of its shortcomings, popular sovereignty could be channeled into effective and regular institutions promoting the common good. Volume 1 of Democracy in America ended, as you all know, with a long chapter about the future of the 3 races, in which Tocqueville voiced a series of concerns about the future of the country, but they were muted ones, in my view. He understood the challenges faced by the Indians and the black population, but he stopped short of suggesting that the stability of the country itself was in question. In spite of his notorious fear of the tyranny of majority, to which he dedicated a long chapter, Tocqueville remained relatively optimistic regarding the survival of the democratic republic in the New World. So all things considered, in Volume 1, the emphasis on an immature and unstable American democracy, a trope that would figure prominently 2 decades later in his correspondence with his American friends, did not appear in Volume 1 of his masterpiece. American institutions, he insisted in Volume 1 of his book, were essentially Republican and enjoyed a strong and genuine universal consensus. In Tocqueville's eyes, the American democracy appeared more or less as a mature and accomplished form of government capable of overcoming its challenges. And America, he predicted, could serve as a political model for the rest of the world and was destined to rise to the status of one of the world's premier powers, with Russia, by the way. Now, published in 1840, Volume 2 of Democracy in America was different in scope and theme. Some asked whether it's part of the same work or not, but the volume qualified its optimistic view by introducing a series of new themes about the democratic mind and the democratic mentality. Tocqueville criticized the excessive materialism of the Americans and worried about their propensity to a new form of democratic soft despotism. He was concerned, among other things, that young Americans lacked high ambitions and were afraid to dream big. They pursued instead mediocre goals, he said, and were vulnerable to a new form of despotism that would control their minds, acting upon them like a tutelary power. Yet in the end, toute proportion gardée, for all of his views on his shortcomings of democracy, Tocqueville did not call into question the viability and maturity of the American democracy in Volume 2. He suggested that Americans were moderate and responsible individuals who practiced the art of self-interest rightly understood. They were capable, in the end, of controlling their passions and were not easily swayed by mob flatterers and demagogues. Americans, Tocqueville opined, displayed common sense, reason, and moderation in their daily exchanges and activities. In spite of his notorious distrust of the middle class in France, and in spite of his anxieties about the pernicious effects of rampant individualism in democratic societies, Tocqueville did not question what it took to be the foundation of virtue of American middle class. L'intérêt bien entendu, self-interest rightly understood. The vices of individualism, he argued, could be successfully mitigated by religion, free institutions, self-government, and local freedoms. More importantly, perhaps, the idea that democracy might engender violence and turmoil, or that the free market forces might become uncontrollable because of the growing multiplicity of interests, seemed implausible to Tocqueville in Volume 2 of Democracy in America. He had little to say here about the possibility of the economic sphere invading the political realm and corrupting its institutions, even if he lamented, it's true, the possible rise of an industrial aristocracy, arguably harsher than previous types of aristocracy in Europe, but more limited in scope. Finally, Tocqueville believed that the greatest dangers to democracy were not anarchy and the ensuing collapse of the political and social order, as French conservatives feared in their own country, but a new form of soft despotism, one that strikes the mind rather than the body and creates a herd of obedient individuals relying on the state for their welfare. The famous chapter he devoted to this topic toward the end of his book has become a locus classicus in the conservative and libertarian circles. So in Volume 2 of Democracy in America, I want to restate 4 important conclusions that Tocqueville reached. 1. To paraphrase Pierre Manon, a perceptive interpreter of Tocqueville, to love democracy well amounts to loving it with moderation. The instincts and the passions of democracy ought to be constantly moderated and held in check, because democracy goes hand in hand with materialism, the tyranny of majority, rampant individualism, and administrative centralization. Second, the task of moderating and purifying democracy can be successfully accomplished by the institutions of the American Republic, benefiting from its tradition of self-government, administrative decentralization, liberty, and religion. Third, Tocqueville believed that political liberty is the greatest remedy for nearly all of the evils with which equality menaces us, and argued that there is only democracy, by which he understood in this case self-government, which can mitigate and make bearable the inevitable inconveniences of a democratic social state. So fourth, and I think most importantly for our purposes tonight, for Tocqueville, the answer to the problems of democracy was not less democracy, as its conservative colleagues believed in France, but more and better democracy, though not political democracy, provided it is a refined form of democracy. As Tocqueville himself acknowledged in a note for democracy in America, the key was to, quote, use democracy to moderate democracy, end of quote. He recognizes that it was, again, quote, the sole path to salvation that is open to us, and went on to describe the task of his generation as follows. Discern the sentiments, the ideas, the laws, which without being hostile to the principle of democracy, without being naturally incompatible with democracy, can however correct its unfortunate tendencies, and while modifying it, become incorporated with it. Beyond that, everything is foolish and imprudent, he concluded. Now, Tocqueville never visited America after 1840, but he followed closely the political and economic developments in the New World. He exchanged numerous letters with his American correspondents in several post-1840 settings. It is, I think, tempting to speculate what would the hypothetical volume 3 of Democracy in America might have looked like if he ever published or written one. So that's exactly what Jeremy Jennings and I tried to do in this book, which Eva mentioned at the beginning, Tocqueville on America after 1840, Letters and Other Writings, a book that we published in 2009. And this is the book to which I like to return this evening. Our book contains Tocqueville's correspondence with his American friends from 1840 until his untimely death in 1859. So a period of 19 years, more or less. We translated and edited several other writings in which Tocqueville referred to America, along with his previously unknown diplomatic correspondence from his tenure as Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1849. These materials, I think, show beyond reasonable doubt that a decade and a half later, after the publication of Democracy in America, Tocqueville had the chance to re-examine some of his previous conclusions about the virtues and the limits of American democracy that are relevant for us today. He came to suspect that his previous hopes for American democracy and freedom had been severely compromised, or he feared so. Our book was divided in 4 parts, covering 2 different decades almost. During the first period, 1840-1847, Tocqueville seemed to have been primarily concerned with geopolitical questions concerning the United States and its foreign policy, expansionist foreign policy. The second period covered the establishment of the Second Republic in France, 1848-1852, and this is when Tocqueville renewed his interest in the American Constitution and the American political institutions. This is the moment when the 12th edition of Democracy in America appeared in 1848 with a significant new preface by the author, which we included in our edition. Tocqueville reiterated here the belief that the institutions of America must remain an object of constant study for Republican France, though not of imitation. He drew a stark contrast between revolutionary Europe in turmoil and democratic and stable America. He recommended to his fellow countrymen to look at America not to copy its institutions in a servile manner, but in order to understand better those institutions that suited the French in their attempt to consolidate republican institutions at home. Now, for us, the third and the fourth periods covered in our book, 1852-56 and 57-59, were markedly different and more interesting. Revisiting his uneasiness about the evolution of American democracy in the 1850s, as the country was edging closer to the Civil War that broke out in 1861, might prove surprisingly relevant for addressing some of the challenges that we are facing today in the United States. This year are in many ways the most interesting for us today as we contemplate once again, and not without anxiety, the future of democratic institutions in America and are reminded of their fragility. Tocqueville closely followed the political developments in the United States in the 1850s when he had an intense correspondence with his American acquaintances. In 1857, for example, he exchanged 42 letters with his American friends. The debates on slavery, immigration, extension of slavery in the Western territories, and the increasing violence in the country caught his attention, along with the corruption of democratic institutions. All these things accelerated after the inauguration of the Buchanan administration in 1857, kind of a Trump administration avant la lettre. The Kansas-Nebraska Act emboldened the partisans of slavery and sharpened their disagreements with the abolitionists in 1854. In his letters, Tocqueville unambiguously expressed his concerns about the declining health and stability of the American democracy. He criticized these issues in harsher tones than he had done in either of the two volumes of Democracy in America. He sensed and feared that the country was in the midst of a radical political, social, and cultural transformation that threatened its stability and weakened its civic bonds. As America's political trajectory raised alarm in many quarters, Tocqueville's faith in the power of the country to serve as a symbol of liberty across the world seemed to have waned to a significant degree. Predictably, his vision of America became darker and gloomier, as he also became worried about his financial investments in American railways. Tocqueville did invest in American railways, and the stock market was going south at the time. Who wouldn't be, I would say. The corruption of the country's institution and morals, the growing violence triggered by controversies around slavery, made it increasingly unlikely, he feared, that America would continue to be seen as a beacon of freedom in the world. It risked becoming instead a country of extreme, fueled by a perverse interpretation of the popular sovereignty that he had previously praised, state rights taken to extreme, and a doctrine of unlimited liberty that was misinterpreted in many quarters. Finally, there was another phenomenon that caught Tocqueville's attention during this time, and this is important, the invasion of the political by the economic sphere, as the country was getting wealthier and the perils of abundance became more and more evident by the day. Now, while it is true that Tocqueville had previously voiced a number of concerns about the state of democracy in America, the letters that he exchanged with his friends from 1852 onward raised a series of concerns that were new, or they were previously muted or played a minimal role. Lurking behind all of these issues, as I've already mentioned, was the issue of slavery and the possible coming apart of the Union as the country entered a new turbulent era in the mid-1850s. But all things considered, I think Tocqueville's position during this period was not unlike that of Lincoln, which is to say he was not an abolitionist, but he did believe unambiguously that the extension of slavery was to be considered a crime against humanity, as he put it in a short article published in Liberty Bell in 1856, which we included in our collection. Tocqueville made it clear that as a foreigner, he did not feel entitled to indicate to his American friends the time and measures by which slavery ought to be abolished. That had to be decided by the Americans themselves. Still, he added, he was pained, quote, and astonished by the fact that the freest people in the world was almost the only one among civilized and Christian nations which still maintained slavery. Tocqueville confessed he was uneasy at seeing slavery tarnish the image of America and furnished its detractor arguments against its own democratic systems. We find many references and comments on issues such as the nascent American imperialism in the 1850s, the decline of mores and the rise of lawlessness, the revolutionary fervor, so to speak, of American politics, and the reckless spirit of what he saw as the emerging American capitalism. Tocqueville expressed serious concerns about the growing immigration to America, its territorial expansion, and the deterioration of the American mores and democratic institutions. Now, what's worth noting here, and I want to make this clear, is that none of these topics had been discussed at length or at such lengths in the previously published two volumes of Democracy in America. Consider, for example, the emphasis on the excesses of democracy. This issue appears much more prominently in his correspondence from the 1850s than in his published works. In the 1850s, Tocqueville's views on America departed from the earlier image of an accomplished and stable democracy, more or less immune to chronic turmoil and violence that can be found in his masterpiece. In 1852, it seems that Tocqueville realized much better than he had done before that it was in the very nature of democracy in general, even in its most advanced democratic regime in the world, to transgress its limits. By slowly subverting its own foundation, it risked bringing about its own demise, Tocqueville feared, as illustrated by the decay of democratic mores and habits of the heart in America. Now, it's interesting that this issue appeared in conjunction with the issue of slavery in the Liberty Bell, and I put here a quote from the letter because it's pretty clear that Tocqueville's position on slavery was unambiguous on this. But much more interesting to me is his position on immigration, which is lesser known. Openness to foreigner as an excessive democracy appeared in conjunction to the issue of immigration, which is rarely, if ever, discussed in his published works. This correspondence is interesting because it reserves some surprises. In a letter, for example, to Theodore Sedgwick from October 14th, 1856, Sedgwick being from Massachusetts, we find a surprising remark made by Tocqueville about the demographic composition of America. And this is interesting because he refers to the German immigrants. What scares me, he confessed, is on the one hand, the prodigious number of foreigners that are turning you into a new people. Referring to the influx of immigrants from Europe in the early 50s, he voiced concern about the fact that America was annually receiving about 140,000 German immigrants coming from a country, in his view, that was not known for its strong tradition of self-government. Is there a German word for self-government? How could they be possibly assimilated into the American life, he wondered, given the lack of public life in Germany and the historic absence of free institutions in those lands? The Germans, Tocqueville wrote in another letter to Sedgwick in October 15th, 1854, lack the basic ingredients of democracy. They are what 2 centuries of absolute government, 60 years of centralization, and a very long habit of administrative dependence as bureaucrats or administrative individuals have made them. That is to say, they lend themselves very well only to servitude or revolution. What can you do with these people when they arrive among you in America? He rhetorically asked his American friend. These are surprising words. I hope you agree with me. Another manifestation of the excessive democracy was the extreme spirit of conquest and adventure that was becoming manifest in many parts of the country. Viewed from afar, Tocqueville commented in early December 1852, it was not a good omen for the future of democracy in America. As your compatriot, he writes to the same Sedgwick in December 1852, I have not seen without apprehension the spirit of conquest and even plunder, which has manifested itself amongst you for several years now. It's not a good sign of health for a people that have already more territories that it can fill. Similar concerns were expressed in another letter to Gerard Sparks of Harvard University a week later, 1852, still, in which Tocqueville pointed out that American democracy had nothing more to fear than its own excesses. An immoderate spirit of adventure, risk, and conquest, he believed, endangers the stability of democratic institutions and risks undermining it. The American democracy, Tocqueville averred, has nothing more to fear from itself, from the abuse of democracy, the spirit of adventure and conquest, from the sense of exaggerated pride in its strength, and from the impetuosity of youth. Worth noting here is Tocqueville's emphasis on the abuse of democracy associated with what? With democratic lack of experience. When it came to recommending a cure for the excessive of democracy, well, you'll see later what he recommended. He recommended exactly what you should have answered in response to Alan Cahan's questionnaire. So I think the interesting question here is, okay, the question, so is this a shift towards a view that emphasizes an unstable and immature democracy instead of a stable and mature democracy? I think that it's without doubt that Tocqueville was keenly aware of the importance of the idea of America for the entire world. And this is a topic that is of prominent importance for us today. Above everything else, America was a symbol and hope for those who lived in despotism elsewhere. And he says elsewhere in a letter to Edward Vernon Child on April 57, which I don't have on the PowerPoint, I passionately desire to see the success of the great experiment in self-government that is currently taking place in America. If it fails, that will be the end of political liberty on earth. Now, in another important letter to Francis Lieber, who emigrated from Germany to South Carolina and then New York, from September 1st, 1856, he worried that what was happening in America at the time would have nefarious consequences for the entire world, exactly what we are fearing today. The decline of democratic institutions and mores in America, Tocqueville wrote, would embolden the enemies of freedom elsewhere and make their position stronger. His words deserve to be quoted in full because they give voice, in my view, to his doubts at the time about the future of liberty and democracy in America. And it's a long letter here. I will just emphasize a few things here. He says, I passionately wish to see a free Europe, and I realize that the cause of liberty is more compromised now than it was at the moment of my birth. I see around me nations whose souls seem to weaken as their prosperity and physical force grow, nations that remain, to borrow Hobbes' phrase, robust children who deserve only to be treated by the means of the stick and the carrot. Your America itself, to which once turned the dreams of all those who lack the reality of liberty, has in my view given little satisfaction to the friends of liberty for some time. One would say that the despots of the old world have entrusted you with performing the same role that the Spartans bid the Helots play in front of their children, and that through their follies and vulgarities that liberty gives rise to, they want to cure them of the desire ever to be free. Now, that letter is concerning to us, at least to me, in more ways than one, because what's striking here is the idea that image of America as a young and immature democracy is present behind these words, and it is considerably different from the portrait of the country that you find sketched in Democracy in America. Of course, the historical context matters here, but it is a notable departure from his previous belief that the Americans, whatever their errors and faults, have shown that the democratic social state does not have to lead to a degeneration of the human race. That was the belief that he expressed earlier. In another letter to Sedgwick from August 29, 1856, he describes America again as a puer robustus, robust child who responded only to threats and rewards. And the letter here is interesting. It's August 29, 1856. And you can see that he reiterates the same concerns about immigration, about the possibility of civil war, and the change in the natural condition. Each day brings you so many foreign elements that you soon no longer be yourself, and all of the arguments about your natural condition will become more and more uncertain. This is a very interesting perspective on America that you do not find in his published works. Now, interestingly, Tocqueville reiterated the same concerns in other letters to Francis Lieber and Nassau Senior from 1856. He emphasized the fact that America risked disappointing the hopes of millions of people for a better future. Far from being a stable democracy, the land of the free was dominated by demagogues, inefficient institutions, rife with violent mores and uncouth habits, incapable of controlling the excesses of the spirit of enterprise and adventure. And I think that this passage from the letter to Francis Lieber, I think it's very relevant for us today. So what's worth noting here is that several major topics from Democracy in America seem to be missing or are underemphasized in these epistolary exchanges. And I would like to point out that those four are self-interest rightly understood, that goes out of the window. Religion as a moderating influence on democracy goes out of the window. There is no reference to democracy in this correspondence as a moderating element. The art of association, well, the art of association is no longer what used to be in volumes 1 and 2. The art of association can lead to precisely episodes of violence. January 6, 2021. And democratic despotism, no longer a concern. So it's interesting that Tocqueville also chose to reflect on what made America original in this time. So before he emphasized the confluence between the spirit of liberty and spirit of religion, individualism, self-interest rightly understood, and so forth. But now it's a combination of primitivism and advanced civilization. So on the one hand, you have in the country elements of high civilization, advanced civilization, and then primitivism, barbarism. And America's primitivism was manifested by several signs, among them an extreme form of the spirit of adventure and risk in his view, and he attributed it to the growing abundance and the limitless opportunities for gain. He was concerned about people taking justice into their own hands and the increasingly imperfect state of the justice system. And it's interesting that in a letter to Sedgwick from October 14th, 1856, he expressed concern about this race of desperate gamblers that your prosperity in a land that is half empty has brought forth, a race which combines the passions and the instincts of the savage with the tastes, needs, vigor, and vices of civilized men. And here's the question that concerns me today. The world has never seen anything like it before. Who can say, he asked, where this might lead if they ever gain the upper hand in your affairs? Who can say where this might lead if they gain the upper hand in your affairs? This is a question worth pondering about, over today, because they seem to have gained the upper hand in American affairs today. In Tocqueville's view, the frantic quest for increased comfort, liberty, and wealth facilitated by the forces of the free market was a major cause of the successes, and I think that it represents a threat to the future of democracy. So I emphasized these letters and the main themes of this correspondence because we have the million-dollar question: what would he say if he visited America today? And I know some of you are vitally interested in this topic, or as vitally as I am. America was a country on the brink in 1850s, and that seems to be a mere chapter in our history books, but it has an eerie contemporary ring for us today, especially for those living on the other side of the Atlantic. It seems to me that democracy is again under threat, and the fragility of our democratic institutions has become a big concern for all of us. Once again, racial tensions, political instability, economic uncertainty, concerns about immigration are at a high level. The country is struggling to come to terms with bouts of violence, January 6th, again, deepening inequalities, racist and nativist episodes, and above all, sectarianism and hyperpolarization, Red America and Blue America. So the rift between the two countries, Blue and Red America, is real and fuels the type of warfare politics that Tocqueville did not and could not perceive at the time, but he sensed something that was amiss. So I think that, we can ask this question: is today America a different country? We can start with equality of condition. This is a multifaceted concept that can be best described as a package of several equalities, as James Schleifer has well described, linked to the concept of democratic social state. It is the opposite of civil inequality, the antithesis of the aristocratic or caste-based privilege. It relies and depends on a set of morals and egalitarian attitudes and beliefs, among which I would say the sentiment of equality and respect for individual dignity play a prominent role. Would he still insist on the equality of conditions if he visited us today and saw the rising inequalities in America, which are mostly economic, true, but there are also hidden civil forms of inequality? Is the sentiment of equality still prominent at the point where, as I said, we live in two different Americas, Red America and Blue America, to the point where people no longer believe that they have something in common, or many don't believe there's something in common? Now, it is hard to speculate on what he might make of this, but we can try this experiment. He could point to the decline of workers' ties to the capital, their declining real incomes, the loss of economic freedom, and the erosion of civic solidarity, to conclude that inequality of condition has gradually replaced the prevailing equality of conditions. And after all, he warned us against industrial aristocracy, whose ruthlessness and greed, he believed, did not bode well for the future of American democracy. But I think that he would also be worried about the rise of a new type of aristocracy, what he might call the financial aristocracy in our era of globalization, where the disconnect between the Wall Street and the Main Street is obvious to many. The finance-based billionaires of today have been thriving in the new global context, but their fabulous wealth, based on high tech, on real estate rather than manufacturing, poses new challenges to the future of American democracy, because these nouveau riches have weak roots in the real world. They live in bubbles, and they have little or no sense of noblesse oblige. In their unrestrained pursuit of wealth, pleasure, and comfort, think only of Jeff Bezos if you want to picture the new. They shelter their capital in foreign tax havens and lobby for tax cuts at home that add only to the country's massive fiscal deficit. That's why I think Tocqueville might advise us to be more cautious about deregulation, eliminating whole programs, or scaling down government offices and policies. But he might also be concerned about the fact that the decline of incivility and the reappearance of racist and nativist impulses around the country threaten the sustainability of democracy in the long term. In his correspondence, as I mentioned, he commented on the rise of the Know Nothing Party, the movement in the 1840s, and the anti-foreigner sentiments. And today he would not be surprised to discover the animus against immigrants being strong again, especially in the MAGA world, a surprising development for a country whose main symbol remains, after all, the Statue of Liberty. Tocqueville might then worry that patriotism might turn into jingoistic nationalism, a threat to democracy, and he would certainly be concerned about slogans such as America First or Make America Great Again. So I would like to end by returning to a statement made by Tocqueville earlier, which is, can we make it more governable instead of make America great again? So how can we make America governable again? And I think that this is why you should have answered the second question in the questionnaire for Alan Kahan, because Tocqueville himself answered it. So since we are in a Tocqueville conference, it would have been proper to, but if you missed it, you can still redo the questionnaire now after my lecture. He writes to Gerald Sparks on December 11th, 52, I could not recommend moderation enough among such good fortune. Nations need it no less than individuals. So it seems to me that there is some room for some good news. I gave you a lot of negative, dark visions of America today. But there is some room for moderation even today. In 1980s, for example, some of us were born before 80s, so we may remember that. Moderates accounted for 60% of the US Senate, okay? That seems implausible today, but still, only 40 years ago. A little over 40% of the so-called independents today tend to be moderates on one or more dimensions of different political scales. 37 to 39 of registered voters define themselves as moderates. Again, doesn't say much, but it's still something. 70% of those who declare themselves moderates would like to see a third major party. Good luck to them. But there's strength in civil society. I mentioned here a few organizations such as Braver Angels. I don't know whether you're familiar with them. Third Way, a think tank in Washington. No Labels, which had a bad press because people feared they would put a third party candidate. American Exchange Project, More in Common, Hidden Tribes, and Heterodox Academy. There are efforts to rebuild the civic bridges in America made from the grassroots level by these organizations. This organization, for example, American Exchange Program, sends kids from Oklahoma to spend a month or so with families in Massachusetts, and kids from Massachusetts to go and spend a month or so with families in Nebraska, precisely because the two parts of the country have little in common at the moment. So despite America's hyperpolarization, the middle is far larger than you might be inclined to think. The exhausted majority here can be opposed, I think, to those who believe that there's no room for hope. There's, I think, Dirk gave a lecture a month ago at Bloomington about exhausted democracy here, and I want to emphasize that there is an exhausted majority here, which might come into one of this category here. So I want to emphasize the difficulty of moderation. So this is a real funambulist or a tightrope walker, and this is what moderates face today. The pressure of the winds, the altitude, you need to take a lot of courage to be up there, not to fall. So this is the cover of one of my books, I should add. But it's, I think, very representative of the difficulty of moderation, because there are different ways in which you can understand this virtue. And in my own work, I try to go beyond the ethical dimension of moderation, which is known. Moderation as a mean between extremes, a moral virtue that prevents passion, linked to prudence, and so forth. I think what we need to emphasize are the institutional and constitutional aspects of moderation. When we talk about moderation, we think in Montesquieu's world, separation of balance of power, distribution of powers, bicameralism, veto power, federalism, and polycentricity, a concept that I borrow from the works of Elinor and Vincent Ostrom. There is also a style and ethos associated with moderation that emphasizes the links between moderation and civility, humility, prudence, compromise, which are the opposite of self-righteousness, fanaticism, and zealotry. So all these aspects of moderation ought to be taken into account. And there are benefits that I want to emphasize here. It allows us to think politically and pragmatically as opposed to thinking dogmatically by the book. It is not an ideology with fixed contours. It has, on the contrary, affinities with different political traditions, and it can accommodate a wide variety of political ideas, views, and forms, even forms of government. And more importantly, in my view, moderation refuses to define one single best way and makes us aware of the political good that is multidimensional and pluralistic. So this is a lesson that one can learn not only from Tocqueville, but also from Montesquieu. And I want to emphasize a few other benefits of moderation. It fosters a flexible and skeptical mindset, which is the opposite of fanaticism and dogmatism, one single good value and principle. For me, even an attempt to write a theory of justice, is, I think, an illustration of this belief that there is one single good that we can elevate above all others. It promotes civility and compromise. It helps lower the political temperature by emphasizing the importance of hearing the other side. May the other side be also heard. And it promotes commitment to dialogue, and it is opposed to echo chambers and monologue. And I think that at the end of the day, Tocqueville would come down in favor of gradualism because moderation accommodates a wide range of political views. It can promote gradual piecemeal reforms. And I think that the gradual and incremental approach to public policy can be an effective way of making change happen, even large scale in the long run. But piecemeal reform allows for new ideas to be tested, corrected, honed over time, and learning occurs by trial and error, and allows us to deal with an uncertain and complex world that is made of many nuances. In praise of nuance, this is how I would summarize Tocqueville's message. Errors can be corrected in due course. And I think that at the end of the day, Tocqueville will side with Montesquieu in praising the virtues of moderate government, even for us today. Again, balance of powers, political pluralism, intermediary bodies, federalism, distribution of power, polycentricity, custom and mores, all seen as tempering devices and prerequisites of freedom. And I think that a form of government that is based on the interdependence of mutually limiting powers and authorities is the key to promoting liberty in today's world. And I think that coming back to Tocqueville, it's important to remember precisely what he wanted, he longed for. It is necessary, he writes in a note to Democracy in America, to find in some part of the work the idea of the middle that has been dishonored in our time. Show that there is a firm, clear, voluntary way to see and to grasp the truth between the two extremes, to conceive and to say that the truth is not in an absolute system. I do not like the middle to be taken between grandeur and baseness, between courage and fear, between vice and virtue, but I like the middle between two opposites, excesses. So Tocqueville's message amounts, in my view, to love democracy well, amounts to love it with moderation. Democracy can and must be moderated and purified of its anarchic revolutionary elements. And America offered to him an example of how this was able at some point and might be able in the future. And again, I think that at the end of the day, the task that we are faced with today in America and throughout the world is to moderate democracy. And this is, again, Tocqueville's message. Today, the primary task of those called to govern modern society is to instruct democracy, if possible, to reanimate its beliefs, to purify its morals, to regulate its movement, to substitute little by little the science of affairs for its inexperience, and the knowledge of its true interest for its blind instincts. And this is from the Introduction to Democracy in America. And again, the message would be to use democracy, to moderate democracy, and this is the passage that I've read earlier, to discern the sentiments, the ideas, and the laws that, without being hostile to the principle of democracy, can work to enhance democracy. So I would like to end with 5 rules for helping democracy survive in America and throughout the world, inspired by Tocqueville. First, no panaceas. Refuse to define one single best way. And I think that Tocqueville, in spite of his commitment to democracy, would endorse this idea. Democracy is not the panacea. Number 2, admit that most political issues have more than one side. Defend eclecticism and fusionism. Resist the temptation to interpret events solely in light of one single value or principle, even in light of justice. Avoid echo chambers, number 3, and do not be sectarian. Keep the lines of dialogue open with your opponents. Easier said than done. Number 4, do not be perfectionist. Start working with the world as is, not as it should be. Defend piecemeal reforms rather than utopian blueprints for change. And finally, do not become obsessed with purity, axis of evil, red lines, or litmus tests. Resist the temptation to divide the universe between forces of light and forces of darkness, between friends and foes. So, that is the message that I'd like to leave you with, inspired by my reading of Tocqueville. I do not expect that you would buy all of these ideas, but I try to suggest, using a panoply of quotes, perhaps too many, that Tocqueville was concerned about America in the 1850s, and I think that we should too be concerned about its future today. Thank you very much.